Okay, everybody, I think we're here. Welcome. First of all, I didn't think we did have sign-up sheets, but we do. So during the break, if you haven't signed up yet to let us know that you're here, please do so. Because we do kind of keep a little flow chart on that. Just, I don't know why, but we do. Also, you might want to look at the website, because I have been populating the recommended reading section there, and that will be further populated in the next week or two with more goodies. Also, in the resources, I'm putting up some YouTube interviews with various people that have been mentioned in our meetings. We've been having some good meetings with undergraduates on Wednesday nights at 7:30, right over here in History Corner. So I'd like to remind the undergraduates of that opportunity again. And then also on the last evening of the class, or the course, what's our assistant's name? Yes, Simon Wiles, doctoral candidate in religious studies, will be holding forth on Asian religious traditions in science. So that should be pretty interesting. That last evening is actually after the undergraduate term ends, but you're more than welcome to come. You might want to take a study break or something like that, and come and sit in on that presentation by Simon. Okay. So now I am very happy to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Paula Findlen. She is the Ubaldo Pierotti Professor of Italian History. She's also the director of the Supe Center for the History and Philosophy of Science and Technology, and she's also director of the Simile, that is Science in the Making. I wrote Stanford in the Making. Science in the Making.
I like that idea.
ILE, Intentional Living Environment, is that what that is?
Yeah, something to that effect. Yeah.
Something like that. Anyway, for freshmen over in Burbank. She's a whole lot of other things too, but I don't want to embarrass her. But I do want to say this, that her research I find just wonderful, so fascinating. She specializes, among other things, in the history of science and also of medicine. And that has brought her into the history of ideas. And so this has brought her very naturally, of course, into Galileo studies. She's also spent a lot of time and is spending time on the history of Renaissance Italy. And I think most interestingly is also doing some work in gender culture and in the history of ideas. Her course titles are very enticing: Heretics, Prostitutes, and Merchants, the Venetian Empire; Science, Art, and Technology, the Worlds of Leonardo; and apropos of tonight's lecture, When Worlds Collide, the Trial of Galileo. So that is going to be really great. She's a prolific writer. You can actually look her up, so I won't embarrass her with all the titles she's written. However, there are a couple of things that she's working on that I find I'm looking forward to seeing in print. One is tentatively entitled The Woman in Love with Newton, The Extraordinary Career of Laura Bassi. Not heard of. Sounds like another part of the story that we need to hear. And then apropos of tonight's lecture, Galileo's Laughter, Knowledge and Play in the Renaissance, and Galileo's Finger, Science and Religion After the Trial. These are all projects that are ongoing that you're involved with. So thank you very much for being here, Paula, and we're looking forward to learning something about Galileo and the trial and the context and its meaning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, the opportunity to talk about the trial of Galileo in this class is irresistible. This is one of my favorite subjects. I first encountered the subjects as an undergraduate, and I've never stopped thinking about it. This is one of these subjects you'll find if the reading that you do this week and the conversation we have around Galileo and his letter to the Grand Duchess Christina inspires you to do more reading. The trial of Galileo, and generally Galileo's life and work, is one of the better documented episodes in the early history of science, and certainly one of the infamously documented episodes in the relationship between knowledge and faith. You can read translations, some of you may have already done so on your own, of the trial documents, of many of the documents that have been discovered over time that are relevant to the unfolding saga of Galileo's relationship with the Roman Catholic Church. Every time I see these documents, something new strikes me. These are documents that require attention, right, to a lot of the subtleties of what's going on. It's very easy to read the trial of Galileo as a simple story, as people have done in the past and still continue to do today, as a kind of warfare of science and theology, as a sort of ultimate simple clash of science and religion. And one thing I hope that I will have accomplished tonight is to get you to think about this as a much more complicated and contingent story, which I think is true of many of these kinds of episodes. And I wouldn't be surprised to discover that this is one of the great themes of the class, is understanding these questions with greater subtlety and sophistication. So what I'd like to do tonight for the lecture is to walk you through the stages of how we arrive at this event known as the trial of Galileo, which is actually more than one event, because it encompasses a much longer period than the trial of 1633. I also hope that what I'll manage to do is to give you some resources to understand the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, which certainly, if this hasn't already been said, should be said, is one of the most important texts ever written in any culture about the possible relationship between knowledge and faith. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Galileo's world and to the background to what becomes in 1632-33 the trial of Galileo. Now, the history of the trial of Galileo, of course, does not begin with Galileo, but with a church official, a church bureaucrat actually, named Nicholas Copernicus, whose uncle was a prominent ecclesiastic figure in what is nowadays Poland, but in that German-speaking region, so he is both claimed as German and Polish simultaneously. Nicholas Copernicus goes down in the annals of history today as one of the important people to revolutionize astronomy during the Renaissance, right? In the 16th century, Copernicus, in his spare time, working over many years, indeed many decades, would produce an enormous work called On the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres, which appeared literally as a deathbed culmination of his many years of work on rethinking the traditional aspects of Western astronomy. So what was it that Copernicus was trying to do? Because this is going to be quite relevant to what Galileo also tries to do in a later generation. Copernicus was not satisfied with the picture of the universe that was offered by ancient and medieval astronomy. He was hardly alone in this. There were many people who had raised questions about many of the problems, both observational and philosophical, about ancient astronomy, right? Was Aristotle's portrait of the universe an absolute portrait, right, that no further evidence could change? This became one of the important questions over not just decades, but centuries, right? Medieval astronomers and philosophers are debating the question about how to understand and interpret Aristotle and whether they should take seriously the ideas on many subjects of this pagan philosopher. After all, he was no Catholic, no Christian. But nonetheless, Aristotle had been embedded as the most authoritative of ancient philosophers in a Western tradition that indeed embraced him as part of the institutional curriculum, right, of Catholic learning from the Middle Ages onwards. So in Copernicus's day, it went without question that a starting point for understanding what we think of nowadays of scientific knowledge was to understand Aristotle well, right, and to imagine a framework of the universe that it began, even if it might not have ended with Aristotle. Similarly, Copernicus was part of a generation that was beginning to have increasingly probing questions about the great corpus of technical astronomy that we associate with Ptolemy, with the ancient Greek philosopher, astronomer and mathematician Ptolemy, right? Also famous for his geography, for his astrology, for many technical writings that offered a mathematical, a quantitative portrait of the universe, both terrestrial and celestial. So Ptolemaic astronomy and Aristotle's philosophy had provided the two cornerstones that combined together to create a qualitative and quantitative portrait of the universe that declared, with absolutely no serious questioning about the alternatives, that the Earth was the static point at the center of the universe, right? That what we stood on lay at the center, and the rest needed to be understood from that center. But was this really true? Even in ancient times, as some of you may know, there were alternative philosophies offered. They simply did not prevail. During the Middle Ages, philosophers also began to question many of the aspects, say, of Aristotle's physics. Less so Ptolemy's astronomy, right? That really belongs to the generation right before Copernicus that begins to look much more fully at the quantitative aspects of this technical body of knowledge that we associate with Ptolemy. But all of this to say is that by the late 15th century, when this young man began to study not only at the University of Krakow in his native region, but also in the Italian universities where he migrated in search of even better teachers and better learning, Copernicus began to ask himself whether a world constructed right out of these two ancient philosophers and astronomers was actually a true portrait of the universe. He began to wonder about these things. And he constructed an alternative portrait that we know nowadays as heliocentrism, right? An image of the universe that he presented on the Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres in 1543 as an interesting and technically viable alternative, right? As easy to compute with perhaps, he argued, greater simplicity and plausibility than a geocentric universe. So as of 1543, an ancient idea had been not just simply resuscitated, but now worked out in enormous technical detail. The idea of a universe centered not around the Earth, but the sun. And you see this here in this image that I've offered you from Copernicus's On the Revolutions, where he, in this simple diagram, displaces the Earth, turns the moon not into another planet, but into some sort of peculiar satellite that has no parallel, seemingly, right? Because there are no other known satellites of any of these other planets yet. And says we should think about this, right? We should think about the possibilities of this. Now, in 1543, Copernicus writes a book that my colleague and probably one of the greatest scholars of Copernicus's work, the historian of astronomy Owen Gingrich, called the book that nobody read. This is a highly technical work. Most people, even nowadays, unless they're specialists, don't work themselves through the whole thing. They tend to read the introductory parts. It is available in a modern English translation if you're interested and want to work your way through whatever amount of it you might like to take a read through. But the point of it is that at the beginning of this book, Copernicus paraphrases Plato and he says, "Let no one who doesn't know geometry enter here," right? So he warns you that this is going to be a deep and deeply technical work. And he also worries in his dedication to the Pope of his day, Paul III, he also worries that perhaps there are issues here that may be of concern to the church. But one of the first points I want to make in thinking about the world that produces the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina is in 1543, almost nobody seemed worried. In fact, for more than 50 years, almost nobody worried about the possible theological implications of a universe that was no longer centered on the Earth, on the part of the universe we inhabit, but centered in some way or had as its static point the sun. So one of the interesting puzzles for us in understanding the long history of the trial of Galileo is why it took so long before people cared about these ideas and saw them as potentially controversial. You know, this is like the story, the parable of the tree that falls in the forest, right? No one heard it for a very long time, and then it thudded loudly and loudly, culminating in the events of 1633. So let me take you on a brief tour that gets us up to some of the reasons why the idea of heliocentrism begins to reverberate by the end of the 16th century and certainly in the early decades of the 17th century, in no small way due to the work of Galileo. But first we have to think briefly about what bridges Galileo. One of the things that Copernicus's book did was to stimulate at least a couple of generations of observational astronomers to go out and do things that even Copernicus himself had not done. Copernicus didn't add a lot of new data to our understanding of the heavens, right? He certainly observed the heavens, but he didn't produce a book that had pages and pages of new observations. What he did was to recalculate many of the pre-existing observations of the previous centuries and show an alternate plausible explanation in great technical detail. So he combines a lot of old data, inserts a little bit of new data. But certainly in offering up an alternate theory, he inspires the next generations to begin to really observe the heavens with greater care, using the instruments that they have at hand, beginning to improve them, and beginning to build up a greater empirical portrait of the universe to decide within this specialist community, right, the people who are competent in technical astronomy, in mathematical astronomy, in observational astronomy, to begin to decide which theory might be correct, or at least a better portrait of the universe. So one example of somebody who did read Copernicus's book is the Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. Still known today as the guy who not only is one of the greatest observational astronomers since Ptolemy, but also is a guy who did a lot of this with a lot of his nose sliced off. He was a nobleman who was known to be quite feisty and got in a duel, and then ended up with a little metal nose piece that he put on and wore for the rest of his life after the duel didn't go so well. But if Tycho Brahe was passionate in this way in his personal interactions, he was also enormously passionate about his science. Tycho was himself a very wealthy man, but what he also was somebody who sold the promise of astronomy as something that a state ought to invest in. Tycho actually is the first person to create a version, a Renaissance version of a national science foundation, which was himself. He got the Danish king in the late 16th century for a couple of decades to invest on a large scale in his project of observational astronomy. He built an entire observatory on an island that still exists today called Findlen off the coast of Denmark near Copenhagen. He built this entire observatory. None of it exists today, though there's probably a little bit of traces of it archaeologically, but very little. It was gone by the 17th century. And he builds these new massive scale instruments. None of them are the telescope. The telescope will come later, as you'll hear in a second. And he builds them, and in the clear northern lights, he observes the heavens. And he manages to increase tenfold the star catalog from Ptolemy's Almagest. Ptolemy had identified about 500 stars. Tycho gives you 5,000. And so he does this in this incredible island of science called Uraniborg that he creates, spending something like 1/12 of the Danish GNP on this. I mean, this is how much he gets his patron to invest in this, which is exactly why it ended up being destroyed, because once his king died, the successor was not so interested and Tycho had to leave, basically. But so what does Tycho do with all this? He doesn't become a Copernican, nor do any of the people, actually, of his generation. What he does, though, is to begin to incorporate enough of Copernicus's ideas and qualifications to create a theory that combines the old and the new that we call nowadays. He doesn't actually use this term, I think, but I'd have to go look again. I'm not a Tycho scholar. But what we call nowadays is geo-heliocentrism, where he says, okay, the Earth is the static point for the whole universe. The moon and the sun revolve around it, and all other planets revolve around the sun, right? He splits the difference. This, too, conforms to the observations they have. So what this points out is exactly the problem, right, that Galileo's generation will also face. On what criteria can you decide what ought to be a better picture of the universe? This is the problem for the technical experts. It's not a larger problem for society until it becomes an issue of interest to society. This continues to be a problem for a handful of people to massage and think about and find new ways to address and answer these questions. One of the people who will do so is Tycho's assistant after he leaves Uraniborg, after he leaves his Danish island of science and goes to the city of Prague to become the imperial astronomer to the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolf II, a plum job, a sign of his enormous prestige. This is the ultimate place to be rewarded for the kind of work you do, because Rudolf was known as a great patron of art and science. This was a glittering international court where people of all faiths and enormous talent came. Tycho was one of them. He brought and moved as much of the project as he could, minus the building, of course, and probably a lot of the glassware, and certainly the big instruments that were a little heavy to carry. He recapitulated it using the emperor's money. And in the process, he hired a young, talented German mathematician named Johannes Kepler to work for him at the end of his life. Tycho died not long after he arrived there. But Kepler had been initiated enough into this project to recognize that the material, the observational data that Tycho had put together was a gold mine, that he could build his own career on to become probably the greatest observational astronomer and technical astronomer of this next generation. Kepler is probably the first person we can really point to as a committed Copernican astronomer, somebody who believes that heliocentrism is truly a better picture of the universe on multiple grounds, mathematically, observationally, and also physically, philosophically, he would say. One of the things that Kepler tries to do is to observe now with these theories in mind, to look very, very carefully, for instance, at the orbit of a single planet like Mars, to see what he can find out. And so by the end of the 16th century, Kepler is beginning to argue in print for the truth of Copernican astronomy. One of the people that he sends his work to in 1597 is a fairly obscure, mostly unpublished mathematics professor at the University of Padua in the Republic of Venice named Galileo Galilei. Galileo mostly didn't respond to Kepler. We would think that the two of them would become absolutely close colleagues at a distance, constantly exchanging information and ideas. Galileo kept it at arm's length. Very few letters between the two of them survive. I think after this first letter, when he basically, I'm not sure if he even says thank you for the book. I think he might indirectly thank him. Doesn't talk to him again for about 12 years until he has a reason to, and then he doesn't talk to him again for another 17 years. This is the greatest astronomical mind of this generation. Galileo is a mathematician increasingly interested in astronomy, who does in some way indicate to Kepler that he too is beginning to think that Copernicus's picture of the universe may indeed be truer than any of the alternatives out there. Well, without going into the long story about why the two of them don't become intimate collaborators, as we would think nowadays they might have, I will make a simple point. Kepler was a Lutheran. Galileo was Catholic. Kepler worked for a Catholic patron. The Holy Roman Emperor was Holy Roman and an emperor, right? You know, he was the alternative to the Pope as far as big patrons you could have. But the world of Central Europe was a very, very different world. Kepler was also a very different kind of mind, an unbounded mind in many respects. You know, he entertained all sorts of ideas. He was open to many possibilities. He wrote about his books, unlike Galileo's, even though both are translated into English, are much harder to read nowadays because I think his is a much more distant and foreign mind for us in the way that he combines things. You know, in the midst of rhapsodizing about the universe, he discovers something that we still think to be mathematically true, but we can't quite figure out how he arrived there when we watch his explanation, because it's not only about mathematics, it's about his metaphysics, it's about a theology. He sees the universe in a certain way because he inscribes the Trinity in it. He is seeing God every time he looks at the universe. He is truly a religious philosopher of nature, a priest of nature, in the way that Galileo never was. And I think this is one of the reasons that Galileo holds Kepler at a distance when he opens the pages of Kepler's books, right? He recognizes the talent. He recognizes that they may be headed in the same direction in terms of a technical portrayal of the universe in certain things, though not in other details. And I'll give you one example before I turn now to Galileo, which is it's Kepler, not Galileo, who comes up with the idea and proves it, right, observationally and mathematically, that the orbits of planets are elliptical, not circular, right? Aristotle, Ptolemy, everybody in the ancient world had said for centuries that, you know, there are perfect bodies in the heavens and they have perfect motions, right? Unlike things on Earth. And perfect motions are circles, right? It's very Platonic. Kepler instead struggles with that because it doesn't match what he actually is finding, right? His data doesn't conform to this, so he ultimately resolves it with a different shape. And with a different explanation as a result. Galileo never accepts this idea. For him, the planets always move in perfect circles, right? In this respect, Kepler is the much more careful observer of the world around him. and in search of much more precise explanations of things, even if the way he does it seems to us to be very ecstatic. All right, well, so this is sort of the background to be thinking about, that colleagues of mine who work on the Copernican world have estimated that circa 1600, there are at best 10 people who have expressed some advocacy of heliocentrism. One is Kepler, one is Galileo, one ultimately is another Italian ex-Dominican named Giordano Bruno, who Kepler likes to read and who Galileo never acknowledges that he reads, and he does read him. Bruno, as some of you may know, is infamously burned as a heretic in Campo dei Fiori in the center of Rome in 1600 by the Roman Inquisition. Not for his science, as is sometimes said, but for many, many complicated aspects of his own ecstatic mixture of knowledge and faith. You know, and again, that's something I'm happy to talk about in discussion, but I just want to kind of put that out there, leave it as one of the stories that, again, like Kepler, in which the story of Galileo orbits. All right, so this brings us now to Galileo and what he offers to the story of Copernican astronomy that I've been outlining. Galileo was a native of Tuscany. His father was a musician in Florence at the court of the Medici Grand Dukes. Galileo would ultimately come back to Florence to great fame to become the chief philosopher and mathematician to the Grand Duke of Tuscany in 1610, after his telescope had changed fundamentally the way in which people did astronomy and what there was to see in the heavens. Prior to that, though, he was a university dropout in search of different careers. He didn't want to be a physician. His father wanted him to be a physician. He was a bad pre-med. Turned out to be, though, a rather clever mathematician, and one who increasingly on his own time, without taking a degree in this, began to demonstrate his skill in mathematics in the way people often did in this period as they'd done in antiquity, by sending problems that he was working on to interesting senior mathematicians elsewhere. This is the beginning of the surviving Galileo correspondence. This work would ultimately parlay him into a professorship without a degree, right? No degree required in the Renaissance, of mathematics, first at the university nearest to his hometown in Pisa, and then ultimately to one of the great universities of this period, the University of Padua, where Copernicus had briefly studied at one point. The University of Padua brought him into the orbit of an entirely different state. As some of you know, Italy is not a nation until 1860, 61. There's a bit of always debate about where to start the process by which Italy becomes a nation. But it's a patchwork of principalities and republics, you know, up and down the Italian peninsula. So Venice, the Republic of Venice, is a different state. When he moves to Padua, he moves to a different state. So in 1609, 1610, as well as in 1597, when Kepler first writes him, Galileo is now a mathematics professor at the University of Padua, working for a state that has a largely diffident and at times antagonistic relationship to the Roman Catholic Church, offers a lot of freedom, right? Has a lot of Protestants going to this so-called Catholic university, is the only university in this period that admits Jewish students, for instance, which is quite interesting when you, again, thinking about this in the middle of this Catholic world. Galileo is teaching at this university. He's not making a lot of money. He's trying to figure out how to pay the bills for his messy family life. And he's looking for inventions and ideas. And he intellectually is concerned with the problem of motion, not as an astronomer, but as we would say nowadays, a physicist, right? Galileo's interest in astronomy did not start with looking at the heavens. It started with the fact that he was generally looking for different places to explore the problem of motion. And it also intersected with the fact that he was the kind of scientific mind that liked to tinker, right? That liked to invent and improve upon instruments. You know, he created a geometric compass that was basically a Renaissance slide rule. Students would pay him extra to take the course in his home. They would buy the pamphlet that didn't have all the solutions because he wanted them to take the course, right? So he was looking for many ways to make extra money on his rather skimpy salary. Galileo would lead his life between these three different states: Florence, Venice, and Rome, right? The center of the papal state, the center of the Roman Catholic papacy. He never lived in Rome, but he went there often throughout his life at strategic moments in search of patronage. And ultimately, at the end of his life, he arrived there, of course, not of his own volition, as he had on the other occasions, but because he was called to Rome on suspicion of heresy, because of his advocacy of Copernican astronomy. So what I want to outline here is how we arrive at that point. What are the ingredients that lead Galileo down a path where in 1632, after publishing one of his most important and controversial works, he will be called to Rome. So Galileo gets Kepler's message. It doesn't push him immediately to study the heavens. Everyone seems to be studying the heavens. They're observing new comets that people have never seen before. They're observing stars, novae, people have never seen before. There are all these novelties in the heavens, right? So they're increasingly, the idea that the heavens is a kind of static, eternal, perfect, unchanging world is falling apart in the hands of analytic philosophers and observational astronomers who are all probing and saying, wait a second, what do we do with this new information? What do we do with these new things that we're seeing up there? What do we do with the old data as well as the new information? So bit by bit, I think Galileo begins to realize that this is a particularly exciting, interesting area. And then in 1609, as he's searching about for new ways to increase his salary and reputation, he's having a bit of a midlife crisis, he's in his 40s. Hasn't published really much of anything, has a local reputation. He hears about these Dutch spyglasses from a friend in Venice via a former student of his in Padua, not in Padua, in Paris, right? Who had studied with him in Padua is what I meant to say. So this little chain sort of says, there are these Dutch spyglasses, and Galileo starts wondering, what are these spyglasses, these magnifying lenses? What are these things? He gets a description, doesn't seem to get the actual object, and from the description of it, from somebody who's, this former student probably, who's seen it in Paris, sends this letter to a friend who then sends it to him, he constructs his telescope in 1609 and makes it better. He takes advantage of Venetian glass making, right? The center of one of the greatest and most sophisticated glass industries, right, in the Western world, still known today for its glassmaking, as a matter of fact. So he gets people to grind, better lenses, and he makes this telescope. He presents it to his employers, to the Republic of Venice. They give him a massive raise, thinking that they have gotten a great piece of Renaissance intellectual property, right? The secret spyglass that will allow them to win battles on land and sea because they'll see everything going on. They're quickly disillusioned, right? Galileo has basically pulled a fast one on them when they discover they're being sold all over Europe, right? Now, that's one side of Galileo that we won't talk about so much today. Galileo Entrepreneur is a great story, right? And Galileo constantly trying to kind of, put himself out there to get the advantage on this and that, including, yes, his great instrument. But none of that story can take away the fact that Galileo is the first person to really take the spyglass, which is largely used for terrestrial purposes, right, as a sighting device, a basic magnifying device to sort of see things, on land, and turns it into a scientific instrument. Right, so in 1609, he turns this instrument that magnifies about 20 times. So not very much, very small glass. He turns this to the heavens, and he begins to observe all sorts of bodies that have been described by the ancients and everyone since then. By early 1610, he's rushed into print a pamphlet called The Sidereal or Starry Messenger. It's translated both ways. It appears in 1610. He is doing this so quickly that he's literally inserting his most recent observations as it comes off the presses. This really is news, right? This is actually a great landmark in the history of scientific publishing because it is scientific news. It's practically a preprint, as scientists would say nowadays. It's so hot off the presses, it's barely published. And he publishes it sort of the way, in imitation of the way in which people like Columbus published their discoveries of these faraway lands, this new world that people have been discovering for the previous century. And Galileo is certainly a reader of these. How do you understand something remote that you've never seen before and probably won't travel to, right? He recognizes there's already a genre to talk about these things. And so he presents you in the Sidereal Messenger with a whole new picture of the so-called perfect bodies of the unchanging heavens, now with the observations from his instrument. He presents the moon, for instance, as we see here, right? Full of craters and other kinds of imperfections that make the moon seem far more Earth-like, right? So what really is the difference between the corrupt and changing earth as Aristotle had described it, and the uncorrupt and eternal heavens, if the moon looks so much like the earth? As people who've studied this text carefully have said, I think rightfully, he exaggerates, of course, what he can see through his telescope, using his own artistic skills and the skills of the engravers to accentuate this. But the point was there, right? That the shadows and the craters, as we noted, they are there to be seen once you begin to magnify it, especially on a clear night with relatively little of the kind of interference and pollution that we have down here. If you go up to, say, the Sierras, you will see a moon that's much like Galileo's, even through his very basic telescope, which is, so basic that it's like an elementary school kid is about what we're talking about, to give you a point of comparison. But what he does in this text is to brilliantly and rhetorically, in words and images, take you through a virtual tour, because after all, who has the telescope except Galileo and a handful of people that he makes it for and presents it as this great and fabulous gift, right? So here, for instance, you see him showing what he sees when he turns his telescope on the Pleiades. All these new stars. So now, rather than the sort of handful of new stars people have pointed to doing naked eye observations, now more and more new stars start to come into view through Galileo's telescope. But the most spectacular thing of all that he shows us is his discovery, which I've shown you here in the image that is on your right, of what he calls the moons of Jupiter, the 4 satellites of the planet Jupiter. And here you see him showing you in this very simple diagrammatic way a kind of diary of observations. I mean, here he really is borrowing from the way Columbus and other discoverers would talk about day by day, sometimes even hourly encounters with novelties, and other landmarks as they see them. So he's sort of showing you, I've seen these odd stars that seem to wander in an interesting way around the planet Jupiter. They appear, they disappear, they reappear, and here is my conclusion, that they are not stars, they are satellites. And therefore, the anomaly of the moon in the Copernican system is not an anomaly. There are other planets with satellites, right? One of the great criticisms of Copernican astronomy was, why should only the Earth have a satellite? So Galileo offers up another much more distant planet that has several of them. But he doesn't say in this text, and therefore Copernican astronomy is right. What he largely does in this text is to present the information and let you draw your own conclusions. He wants you to be a virtual witness to his observations, to participate in them, to be persuaded by them. So this is what he's trying to get you to do. This text was not just scientific news, it was news absolutely everywhere. Galileo almost overnight became an international celebrity, right? In many ways, he is the first scientist, I think, to have a kind of celebrity. Isaac Newton, as some of you know, will be buried in Westminster Abbey when he dies in 1727. But Galileo precedes Newton in this kind of heroic reception, right, of the novelty of, in this instance, new discoveries more than new ideas. And yes, of course, what an instrument can do for opening up a whole new field. So one of Galileo's jobs was to produce, as quickly as possible, instruments for strategic patrons, right? The gift of the book and the instrument traveled everywhere, including to Prague. It wasn't given to Kepler, but it was given, of course, to the emperor. The book was given to Kepler. That's why he writes back to him finally after 12 years, is he finally has a reason why he wants to not so much talk to Kepler, but to get Kepler to say, yes, Galileo is right, which Kepler does. And puts it into print. He also sends this book to one of the leading astronomers, arguably the leading astronomer in Italy, who is in Rome, who he had met when he was a jobless mathematician, meeting important mathematicians. This is the Jesuit Christopher Clavius, who was professor of mathematics at the Roman College, the central organ of Jesuit education, and who had created the most important textbooks of mathematics and astronomy, critical editions of Euclid, commentary on the Sphere of Sacrobosco, which was the leading medieval textbook of mathematical astronomy. He had created these textbooks. They were used all over Europe and beyond to train mathematicians. He had created an entire Jesuit school of mathematics. He was a careful and precise mind, and yes, a good observer of the heavens. So it was very important to Galileo that he get this Jesuit astronomer as well as the Lutheran in Prague to say, yes, when I look through Galileo's telescopes, I see what he sees. and Clavius did. Right? So this was an enormous victory for Galileo, that he now, overnight, is transformed from a mathematician who hardly publishes into a really important astronomer who's the cutting edge of a new field. So needless to say, in the ensuing years, and this will now bring us up to where we need to go, right, in this discussion, in the ensuing years, Galileo observes more and more. Within the next year or two, he begins to do observations of the sun. He learns very quickly not to observe directly, though he, like a number of early astronomers, certainly suffered the effect on their eyesight. It's one of the reasons that Galileo does go blind towards the end of his life. As John Milton famously writes when he visits him, in exile in his villa of Arcetri outside of Florence. Galileo's observations of the sunspots then produce a text, his letters on sunspots, that he writes and publishes in 1613. And here I've shown you from the Latin edition, example of, again, how he's showing you and constantly refining the ways to diagram the observations that you may or may not see. In this text, unlike the sidereal messenger, he begins to now advocate that what he is seeing lends credence to Copernican astronomy. It is making it, as he says, truer and truer every day. That is a bold statement. So what has he done here? He has shown that the sun, the most perfect of all bodies, right, is imperfect. It's not just the moon, it's not just all these new stars, it's not just that Jupiter has satellites, the sun has spots on it. And more to the point, you can follow those spots to watch its rotation on its axis. These sunspots also become, a way to observe the motions of the heavens. So now he begins to more openly advocate things he has been thinking about, even prior to his invention of a scientific telescope. And this is when trouble begins. And this will lead us to the text that you read, the letter to the Grand Duchess. As I've already commented, virtually no one really worries about the theological implications of Copernicus's book in the decades immediately after 1543. One or two people do, both Protestant and Catholic. I'm happy to say more about that, but really one or two people. I mean, these are conversations that go nowhere, that never become large. They begin and they end, and we can just look at the little traces of them. The larger conversation about whether or not Copernican astronomy may in some way be contrary to Scripture and therefore to faith begins because of Galileo's publications and is especially triggered by his observations on sunspots. So already Galileo's celebrity has brought attention to Copernican astronomy in a way that it never had in its original form. Galileo wrote delightful, accessible prose. The only book he ever publishes in Latin is actually his Sidereal Messenger, and he does so to gain an immediate international audience. Everything else that he publishes in his own lifetime, even though it will be translated into other languages, including Latin, he publishes in Italian, which means it's accessible to non-specialists. So one of the things that triggers the story that becomes the trial of Galileo is the fact that he is an accessible writer as well as a controversial thinker. And his letters to sunspots, written in Italian for a much broader audience, begin to get people much more uneasy about to what extent, right, is this new astronomy going to topple certain aspects of our worldview that is not simply technical, but also moral, theological, metaphysical, right, we would say. And this is what leads Galileo to write a series of unpublished writings that become the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, which I want to underscore is unpublished until later in his life. It is not published till after the trial. It is published in the Netherlands after the trial, right, by a Protestant publisher who's also publishing his other works and disseminating them. If this book had been published in Italy, that's something I think we ought to talk about. If this book had been published in Italy in 1615, I think this story would have reached its culmination immediately in that moment, right? And it was very important that Galileo did not. But these unpublished letters about what the relationship might be between science and faith circulated widely. So how did this story that you've read a piece of today begin? Well, it began as a conversation between one of Galileo's most important disciples, named Benedetto Castelli, himself in religious orders, not a Jesuit, And Castelli was ultimately professor of mathematics at Pisa and founded a very important Galilean school of mathematics between Pisa and Rome. So Castelli, being Galileo's disciple, is invited to dinner conversations by the Grand Duke and the Grand Duchess of Tuscany and is asked to debate all sorts of questions. And one of the questions that comes up, pushed especially by the philosophers and theologians who are adherents to Aristotle and adherents to a more conservative view, right, of these kinds of issues, proceed cautiously, is whether or not Copernicanism might contradict the Bible, whether or not these findings are contrary to scriptures. Castelli, after dinner, goes home and he writes a quick letter to Galileo saying, hey, I've had this conversation, I want you to know about this. So Galileo writes a letter back to Castelli that is not just a simple letter whipped off, but is a letter that he's worked on, in fact, with the help of Castelli, after all, who's a theologian, right, where he begins to draft the ideas that are the seeds of the letter to the Grand Duchess 2 years later. So he begins to work out what you see of this idea that two truths cannot contradict each other, that there are different ways to read the words of the Bible, that the wording of the Bible is not intended to be a scientific portrait of the natural world, all of these kinds of issues that he then will refine even further. Multiple copies of this letter circulate, right? And they circulate now, when we think about the difference, say, of the story of Copernicus, they circulate not just among, or even primarily, to Galileo's fellow mathematicians, but they circulate, to leading religious and political figures and to people who are interested, who simply want to get a hands on a copy. So one of the places the letter to Castelli will end up within a matter of 2 years is in the hands of the Inquisition, sent forward as a document by Galileo's critics in Florence, who are largely Dominican theologians, sent forward as part of the documentation, right, that says, hey, I think this matter deserves some investigation. Galileo's response to this comes in many forms. One of them is to write an even more polished version of this letter to one of the leading political figures in the region, who was known for her great piety, the Grand Duchess Christina of Lorraine, right, the wife of the Grand Duke, the mother of the current Grand Duke that he had been the mathematics tutor to. And as I said, he writes this on the eve of what becomes what many people have called the first trial of Galileo, which I will now get to, here, so we kind of get into this story. But I want you to be thinking about this as a kind of letter in process. Galileo keeps rewriting and writing this letter. The last version of what is the letter to the Grand Duchess of Christina appears in a letter to a man who facilitates his publications in Northern Europe, in Protestant Europe, after the trial. And the person he's writing to then is an Italian Protestant from a Protestant family that had fled from Tuscany to Geneva, who then is working in Paris and offers himself up to facilitate Galileo's contact and the dissemination of Galileo's ideas. So Galileo continues to think that his project of thinking about the proper relationship between science and religion is one of the things that he can offer to his world. It certainly, I think, is one of the reasons why he is offered up as the sacrificial victim as well, to his, we should say, his boldness, his, impolitic nature, and yes, his unwillingness to give up on his convictions, even under trying circumstances. All right, so the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina is written on the eve of what many have called Galileo's first trial, which importantly, well, I've used this term, is not actually a trial of Galileo in any direct sense. It really is an examination of writings that defend the ideas of Copernicus. So, towards the end of 1615, Galileo gets wind of the fact that there are accusations going on in Rome and feels that he should go to Rome. Friends dissuade him, but he feels he should go to Rome, to see if he can help alleviate the problems that are emerging. He does not succeed in doing this. And despite the vision that he offers in the letter to the Grand Duchess of how these issues might be resolved, because two truths cannot contradict each other, the Roman Inquisition thinks otherwise. And in February of 1616, they do not condemn Galileo, but they certainly condemn heliocentrism, right? The idea that the sun is a stationary point, the idea that the earth moves. And they say of this, the inquisitors say, right, that this proposition is foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical, since it explicitly contradicts in many places the sense of Holy Scripture. Now, this phrase, foolish and absurd in philosophy, needs to be taken as one part of this, right? That is actually a scientific judgment in some respects, right? And I want you to understand that in this period, the term science doesn't exist in the way we think about nowadays. The term that is closest to the term science is natural philosophy, to have a philosophy of nature. So there are kind of two judgments embedded in this. One is that this idea is foolish, right? As a scientific idea, this is foolish. Why? Because it contradicts Aristotle, and Aristotle's philosophy is the foundation of the writings of Thomas Aquinas, right? So Thomism is an synthesis of Christianity and Aristotelianism. We have no, in their view, we have no concrete proof that we can recognize yet, unlike you, Galileo, or anybody who adheres to Copernicanism, that you really have proved your point, right? They are not yet convinced. But, second point, it is also formally heretical, censored explicitly. So these are two separate points embedded in one thing. You want to kind of separate them and read them together. The corollary of this is to place a series of books on the index of prohibited books. So at the beginning of March, the Congregation of the Index does that. And I want to give you, I've put up the whole thing, just for the heck of it, not because we need to read it, the whole thing, but then I can provide the PowerPoint, so then if anyone wants to take a look at the close wording. There are also many versions of this available online as well. But so this is what the decree of the Congregation of the Index says. And I want you to kind of, again, see this as an example of the complexity of what actually is being discussed, right? So whereas it's come to the knowledge of the said congregation that the Pythagorean doctrine, so this is a reminder that Copernicus even himself presents his ideas as inspired by Pythagoras, as a revival of an ancient idea, which is false, they repeat this, false and altogether opposed to Scripture. And they then say it's taught by Copernicus, but now I want to point out the other people you've probably never heard of who are in here, and by Diego de Zuniga in his book on Job. Diego de Zuniga is a Spanish Augustinian. He's a theologian. He's not a scientist. He's written a commentary on the book of Job, in which he reads a certain passage with an eye to the possibility that this new theory is right. Then they go to say, whew, it's not really being accepted by many. Fortunately, mercifully, not too many people have accepted this, despite that commentary on the book of Job and Copernicus. And then they mention a third book by yet another theologian, a Carmelite from Naples, well, who's in Naples anyway, named Paolo Antonio Foscarini, right? So what has Foscarini, the Carmelite, written? He's written this book on the opinion of the Pythagoreans and of Copernicus concerning the motion of the earth and the stability of the sun, et cetera, et cetera. They give you all the publication details, you know. Wherein the said father attempts to show that the aforesaid doctrine of the immobility of the sun and the earth's motion is consonant with truth and not opposed to Scripture, right? So Foscarini, I mean, find a little passage in a book on Job by that Spanish Augustinian, not so great. Copernicus, done this technical work that no one reads, not so great. But okay, Foscarini, this Carmelite, has written a whole book doing exactly what Galileo does in the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina. So where is the letter to the Grand Duchess Christina is one of the first things I want to raise. Why is that not on this list? Partly because it's not published? Yes. Perhaps also because they are protecting Galileo, right? They do not wish to put him up as the victim. So then their decision, what do? They put all of these books on the index of prohibited books, but in two different ways that are an important distinction. Copernicus and Zuniga are suspended until corrected. And both of them are, to my knowledge, corrected. Copernicus certainly is, within a matter of 5 or 6 years. By the early 1620s, the corrected version of Copernicus, which literally means there are two ways to correct. One is to publish a version that takes out all the stuff that is objectionable, right? So you make it a hypothesis, you know, much more hypothetical. It's not that heliocentrism is true. It's an interesting idea to discuss, but in a way that in no way contradicts the literal meaning of Scripture or the judgment of this august body. There are copies in which you just cross it out, like Galileo's copy crosses out. He does what a good Catholic should do. He donat corrigator, he corrects, right? Foscarini, that book has to go, right? No, there is no correction for Foscarini's radical reading of theology, you know. Theologians in Naples are generally not liked in Rome. They generally are radical. Naples was an incubator of people like Giordano Bruno, just to give you a sense of that. Bruno was a Dominican from Naples, and well, from southern Italy, who was in a convent in Naples early in life before he gave up that ghost. So this gives you kind of a sense. So where is Galileo in this? I've told you that he goes to Rome. Galileo, 2 days after the Roman Inquisition says, this is what we're going to do, is called into the office of one of the most important members of the Inquisition, the Cardinal Inquisitor and Jesuit Robert Bellarmine. Very interesting, very important figure, one of the most important theologians of this period, or one would argue of any period, right? Certainly a very important theologian, right? Of not only his own time, but in the long history of Catholicism. And again, let me just give you the highlights. So they give him this special injunction in person, and they basically say, okay, we want to tell you personally, right, personally and in person, you know, as they say, to relinquish these ideas. And here's the key passage, it's about halfway through, not to hold, teach, or defend it in any way whatsoever, verbally or in writing. So they tell this to him in person. Bellarmine is standing there, having called him in and said, look, we got to tell you something. The person who delivers this, the commissary, is the Dominican who is the head of the Inquisition, and the notary writes this down. This is the version that ends up in the archives that will haunt Galileo years later. Galileo asks for a version of it, which seems to be missing some of the words, and a lot of ink has been spilled about why. Some of the wording of the copy Galileo has at home that he pulls out in the so-called second trial in 1632-33 look different than the one that they rediscover in the archives. But there you have it. This is what he is told. Here is your get out of jail free pass. Be very hypothetical and do not teach, advocate, etc. So why does Galileo forget all this? And this is where I want to end, you know, because then we can open this, take a break and open this up to discussion. Well, we need to think of the whole range of opinions in the church, including Bellarmine's. In many respects, Bellarmine is often misrepresented as an unsympathetic figure in this story, as he also is in the story of Giordano Bruno. But Bellarmine was a very interesting man, deeply interested in questions of science as well as theology, thinking actively. And, you know, if you read more deeply into the story, you see that Bellarmine, even to Foscarini, who he corresponds with, says, when and if you can give me proof that I don't believe you can find, right? He doesn't think from his own reading of these texts that you will find the proof. Then we will have a reconsideration of the issue. But he belongs to that camp. He's open to the possibility, but he doesn't believe they've arrived at the point of certainty. And until they do, the reconceptualization of the relationship between knowledge and faith cannot happen, right? Because you don't take the certainty of faith with the uncertainty of a new scientific idea and put the two together. You know, in his view, this would be disastrous in the long run and short-sighted should that idea change. That's not perhaps a bad point, right? We know that knowledge does change, even if we might put this somewhat differently nowadays. Even more sympathetic was a young cardinal who was working for the Congregation of the Index named Maffeo Barberini. He was from Tuscany. He was very young, very liberally minded. He was so excited about Galileo's work. He wrote poetry about Galileo. And in 1623, he would become Pope Urban VIII. Galileo felt he now had a friend in Rome, a really good friend, a man who in their letters called him his brother. His friend, my friend and brother, Urban would write to him, while also writing poetry about him. But it is often said, rightfully, that the office makes the man. Urban, the young cardinal, liberal and open to all ideas, who had said in private conversations, it seems, that the decision of 1616 was a mistake, and he wished he could undo it, was, of course, not entirely the same man when he held the office as Pope, under many, many pressures that certainly, at this moment, I don't want to kind of give you a whole lecture on, because I think I really want to focus on this earlier period, but I want to get you to thinking that Galileo, one of the stories of this, is Galileo decides to conveniently forget about what Bellarmine and the Dominican Inquisitor have told him in 1616 because he thinks that Rome has changed and that they will not return to these issues. He composes arguably one of his greatest works, his delightful dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. Ptolemaic and Copernican, presented as a conversation among two of his dead friends, one Venetian, one Florentine, who were actually his friends, and a guy named Simplicio, kind of stupid, bumbling Aristotelian who just never got anything. The dialogue is not just a tour of all sorts of ideas about astronomy, it is a whole vision of culture and knowledge. It is a world unto itself, right? It is one of the greatest literary documents produced at the end of the Renaissance in Italy, which is why Galileo is still taught today for his style, right, as well as his science in Italian schools. Galileo works endlessly on this book in the 1620s. This is going to be the culmination of everything that is possible in the papacy of his friend Urban VIII. He publishes this book in 1632 and discovers he's completely wrong. What is the reward for the culmination of his final rollicking presentation, written as a dialogue, so it's not a polemic, right? He's not saying Copernicus is right, QED, right? He doesn't write, a polemical, dogmatic treatise. He writes a delightful dialogue in which people present different opinions, but of course, like most dialogues, it's pretty clear where his heart lies, right? That he thinks anything that's not heliocentrism is pretty stupid. So the reward is to be called to Rome now in September of 32. He tries to delay. Finally, he's told, we don't care how old and how sick you are, you have to get down here, right? And so, February of 1633, he arrives, given special treatment again in many ways, but ultimately forced to undergo a trial. And I haven't made the trial the focus of the discussion tonight, just because those aren't the documents that you've read, but as many of you know, by the end of this trial, he learns that no matter how clever he is, he must absolutely renounce what he has come to believe greatly since the 1590s, when he first told Kepler that he agreed with Copernicanism. He receives his sentence on the 22nd of June, and is forced immediately after that to abjure publicly his views. And again, I've just put up here, and I think this is a little bit too small because it was a little too full to put on. If I take these are not reading glasses, I can't even read it on my own screen this way. But just to give you a sense of the flavor, right, of what the Inquisition says. You've rendered yourself, right, as confessed above, you've rendered yourself in the judgment of this holy office vehemently suspected of heresy. Why is he vehemently suspected of heresy? Because they have found that injunction offered in 1616 to him personally, and have realized that he has never once in the process of publishing a book on Copernicanism mentioned that he had that injunction. That was a horrible mistake, right? This is an example of the optimism that he should not have had. The rediscovery of that document completely changes the course of this trial. And in many respects, one might say also, at this point, a kind of review of all of the past events, the letters on Sunspots, yes, the well-known, if unpublished, letter to the Grand Duchess Christina, again, never mentioned in the trial, right? But all of this, I think, implicitly becomes part of the background and the pattern of intent that they come to assess, but assess in light of the fact that there is a document sitting in their own archives that Galileo also has a copy of, that he produces on demand when asked about it once they discover that document in their archives, that does indicate that he had been told not to defend, teach in any way whatsoever these ideas orally or in writing. What has he just done? He has published a book on these things, right? But from which we are content that you be absolved, provided that first, with a sincere heart and unfeigned faith, you abjure, curse, and detest before us not only those errors and heresies, but every other error and heresy contrary to the Catholic, et cetera, church. And this, of course, is what Galileo does. The legacy of Galileo's trial lives on in many ways, and this is where I just want to conclude with perhaps returning to something that Paul had mentioned earlier about, that I saw a couple of people laugh who I think know the story about Galileo's finger. Galileo may not only be the first scientific celebrity, but I think he actually is the first scientist whose body was treated as like the body of a saint, right? When he was reburied in the 1730s, two of his fingers, and I think a couple of his vertebrae, were removed from the corpse in the very obscure grave of Galileo that he'd been given because he was a penitent Catholic, right? disgraced Catholic. Urban would not allow the grand ceremonial burial that the Grand Duke of Tuscany wanted to give him in 1642, so he was buried very privately and quietly, but then redug up. The reason today, when you go to the Galileo Museum in Florence, that there are now, and the second finger is actually a recent rediscovery, which is a whole story too about what happened to those relics. There used to only be one of Galileo's fingers in the museum, there are now two, right? But the reason that Galileo's fingers, plural, now exist today in a museum, I think says a lot about the ultimate denouement of the story of Galileo as a Catholic scientist, you know, who ultimately was sanctified indeed for his vehemently suspected heresies, in many ways by a later generation of Catholics who, of course, saw Galileo as a beacon of their modernity. So I'm looking forward to the discussion after break, but thank you very much for your attention during the lecture.